Hey there, friends. I hope that you enjoy this episode of the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast as much as I enjoyed making it. I want to take a moment here at the beginning to extend a special offer, an invitation to you, our dear listeners, to join the Remembering course. Our next start date is going to be in middle of March. This is a powerful, deeply moving, and for many people, transformational experience into the heart of colonization, climate change, family histories, ancestors, and so many other critical intersecting pieces. Just visit our website, Sequoia Samanvaya. All the information is in the link below.
Hello, and welcome to the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast. My name is Sarah Jolena Wolcott, and I am your hostess on this sacred learning journey of unraveling, unveiling, and becoming more fully alive at the end of the world as we know it. Hey there, rememberers and reenchanters. Most of the podcasts that I've been having the pleasure of doing recently have been via conversation and storytelling. This particular podcast is a bit different. It comes out of the work that I've been doing for the past 7 years or possibly more on circular time. When I was explaining and talking about circular time with one of my spiritual direction clients recently, she asked if I had an audio or recording that she could listen to about it, because the ideas were really interesting. And I think she also liked the idea of letting it be almost like a background meditation and space for her to listen into. I realized that in most of my podcasting, I haven't done that. And so I started to write. And as I was writing what I would hope to become an audio episode, I realized there were just a whole bunch of things that have been drumming around in the back of my head. And I began to hear a bit of a rhythm and a bit of a beat. And that became this podcast episode. Sometimes I repeat myself. Sometimes it's a bit like poetry. Sometimes it's more like an essay and an explanation. I'm hoping that in all of these different ways, it's helpful for you, wherever you may be. It is an invitation and even an invocation more than just an explanation, though there is some explanation and some exploration, and hopefully together it all creates some greater sense. I am speaking this at the dark time of the year, which I think is a particularly wonderful time to talk about time. And I invite you to listen to this in whatever way that supports you, laying down, in the bathtub, on a long car drive, doing the dishes, knitting. Maybe you can hear some of the message behind the message. The river beneath the river. So you see, I'm inviting you here into a journey. And it's a journey with a fair amount of non-linearity. I'm not laying this all out in a 1, 2, 3 step format. And that teacher in me wants to be clear that in the course that I offer around circular time and remembering, I do a lot more laying things out step by step, clear, do-it-yourself approach. Circular time is a tangible, crafty, and fun toolkit. So yes, I totally offer that kind of directional step-by-step approaches, and that's not what this podcast is. Now, if you're someone who loves to mind map ideas, I know I am, you might have fun making your own mind map out of this podcast. Mostly, though, I invite you to journey with me and see what kinds of connections and further questions emerge as we connect the disconnected. At the end of this podcast episode, there is some music by my friends at Wild Revival. I'm hoping their music, as well as the pauses and my own flute playing throughout this episode, will support your journey and give you some spaciousness to let the connections around time and place intertwine within your mind, your body, your heart, your ecosystem. To lose our relationship with land is to enter into a state of falling through time. We become unmoored. That loss, that separation happened a long time ago. I don't know if most of us can even remember the loss, that moment when your identity became tightened, constrained, reduced, fenced in to this thin barrier of skin. Later, this would be called variations of racism. When our sense of self became reduced to the single self, just a person, singular identity, not fluid information. We were separated by force or by choice or some strange combination of all of them from land. We also became separated from the way we have known. By we, I mean us as humans have known and lived in time. You see, you sense, you know somewhere, I mean at least the rhythm of your breath knows this, that lands and waters and sun and moon create the cycles of time. Time is found in the pattern of days and nights and seasons, in which humans create rhythms and meters and rhyme, giving sense to what is so often chaotic. In the waxing of the moon, we found a tempo, a rhythm, a meter, a rhyme. In her waning, we learn to face this reality of suffering and release and death and exhale. And I'll say it again, in the pattern of the moon, we find meter and rhyme. To live is to cycle, the cycle of breath, the cycle of cells living and dying, the cycle of blood pulsing, hormones flowing, thoughts rising and falling, menses coming and going and flowing. To live is to participate in cycles grander and older than we are, the cycles upon which we must depend. This is what we might think of, call, refer to, affirm as earth time, the time of reality and relationships and relativity and humanness, of animalness, of ecosystemsness. For most of human life, earth time begins in darkness. Sun circles the galaxy, earth circles sun, moon circles earth, oceans pulled by moon breathe tidal breaths. Day follows night, or should I say that night births day. Winds and water circling the planet bring seasons. We cycle through life, birthing, growing, aging, dying, composting, rebirthing. Women's menses cycle, echo, moons, cycles. Every single breath is both a measure of and itself co-creating time with all of the other beings, and most especially those trees and plants. Thank you. Time is dynamic. Time cycles and it keeps going. Time is embedded in our bodies. Time is embedded into place. It is embodied, and every person who has ever worked with a cat or a dog or an animal know how much animals know time. To lose our relationship with land and with place is to enter into a state of falling through time. We become unmoored, unraveling. It did not happen all at once, but I heard that it all broke more or less at the same time. Unmoored we float, unmoored we fall through time and space itself, grasping for that which we feel we don't have enough of, time itself. Time moves in strange ways when, or rather when we become disconnected from space. The default modern culture in which we live our lives and which create our calendars, which are conceptualized as blocks and squares and lines of one thing ending and another thing beginning, refers to the overarching process of disconnecting people from place as progress. The term progress itself suggests a linear conception of time. This linear notion of time is at least as old as colonization, and in many ways it is much older than that. A linear conception of time is, in and of itself, not Earth time per se. Earth time is not clock time or digital time or colonial time. Earth time is expansive and relational and abundant. All there is time. Time embedded in and lived through all beings. Cosmovisions, the way that humans see the world, and related cosmographies, the way we map and move through the world, create our calendar systems, by which I mean the ways in which we're making sense of time. Cosmovisions underlie liturgical cycles and other versions of temporal technologies. Temporal technologies, which can include calendars and clocks and a wide variety of timekeeping devices, shape our daily life. Perhaps even more importantly, they shape our shared collective life. There is a reason that the ancient deities of time are often imagined to be holding up some kind of world. Sometimes, as in the Mayan calendar, they are hunched over, for the weight of time is a great burden. We are part of wheels within wheels, orbits surrounding and intersecting with orbits, cycles around, within, in between other cycles. And to carry all of that is beyond the scope of mere humans. No surprise that the gods of time are also the gods of destiny and of death and of rebirth. They are the gods of power. Time is not purely linear, but in our modern world, built on abstractions and disembodiment and the need for coordination across different ecosystems, leans heavily upon linearity. Now, beneath and around all of this is some simple truth that within each ecosystem, which has its own way of keeping time, its own form of calendaring, and these are not paper calendars, they are not marked by squares and numbers, but by a kind of collective co-arising. To live from and alongside the land and the waters is to embed oneself into these cycles, and we are separated from that. And so you see, I fear that it is possible that we have been falling through time for quite some time. The varieties of what some academics, such as anthropologists, refer to as ecological calendars are immensely varied. Different people in a similar ecosystem might create some very different rhythms of engaging with time. depending on where they live. But all of them relate to aspects of both land and culture, language and ritual, economies of trade, and unforeseen forces. By and large, they are deemed utterly necessary for life itself to continue. All of them are codes forming codexes. Bioculture is one term for the way nature and human societies co-evolve. Humans create ecological calendars and cyclical temporal technologies because that's how we can work with reality. We do so in all sorts of places, across far more ages than I know of, in as many variations as there are ecosystems and epochs of worldviews. Here are just a few, and I'm just skimming the surface of the way that calendars evoke worldviews and shape our shared experiences of time and consciousness in cyclical ways. The oldest still standing calendar in the world is in Africa. Really, where else would it be? It's a kind of stone circle. Similar megalithic stones are found across the nations in Senegal and Gambia. Most people are familiar with Stonehenge in southern England. It is but one of many, many forms of physical temporal technologies evoking rhythm and rhyme, storytelling and procession, fire and starlight and sunrise, human song and the echoes of the unseen as well as the known world. In Ireland, the circular time probably most common is the Celtic wheel of the year. Sometimes you find it etched in stone in a two-dimensional surface like a gravestone. Sometimes in the physical dimensions through other configurations of standing stones. Throughout the Islamic world there is the Hijri, a lunar calendar linking the story of Allah and the prophets with cycles of sacred months, sometimes referred to as forbidden times. The Mayan calendar, which might be the most famous cyclical calendar of all, lauded by the Spanish as the most accurate calendar of its time, although the Spanish never used it, seeking to maintain their position as superior, is built upon key aspects of Mesoamerican thought taking back to at least the 5th century BC. The Nordic Vikings have a lunar and solar calendar cycle depicted as a long oval befitting their position on a tilted globe, where the sun can be all day long, and the dark can be all night long, and day and night change throughout the year. The Chinese zodiac reflects the cycle of the stars, is based on the moon, and has a 12-year cycle. Yawuwu in the land currently known as Broome, Australia, have 6 seasons in their calendar based on the movements of animals and plants. Old Christian and Jewish calendars are also cyclical as well as linear. Multiple indigenous traditions in America rely upon the calendar of the turtle's back, a symbol so rich and multi-layered that it contains creation stories, stories of transformation, of destiny, a place, a land, of water, of going in between, on top of, and underneath, all within the stories of time. Embedded in each of these calendars of cosmovisions are livelihoods, how people live together. That includes patterns of trading, making, crafting, building homes, storytelling, singing, making music, getting married, burying the dead. Cycles of planting and harvesting and foraging and hunting and processing, of eating and drinking and composting. Of course, there are usually ways of stopping the cycles of time. Death and birth and sickness interrupt and also enable the cycles of life to continue. So far as I can tell, cultures embedded in sustainable and regenerative lifeways tend to carry with them both a cyclical pattern of understanding lifetimes as well as a multidimensional appreciation of time. Liminal time, yes, but also the experienced understanding of the past in the present. And sometimes the future is in the present. And sometimes the past is so much with us that we just refer to the past as ancestors. Ancestors who inform the living. Ancient and modern mingle. We reinterpret that which we have inherited. Colonization disrupted the ways in which time was embedded in place. I don't mean that colonization was the only thing that did this, or the first necessarily, sometimes it was, but at the scale, violence, and dramatic change in a short period of time, the European colonization of much of the world did something we are still just beginning to acknowledge. Colonization dismembered time from place. The Gregorian calendar and its seasons, meters, liturgical holidays was universalized, projected onto traditional ecological calendars around the world. It is hard to overstate the level of destruction, confusion, and loss of traditional ecological knowledge that this has brought. Centuries later, modern physics gives us the concept of space-time, reminding us that time is actually far more relative than abstract. There are many books about this. Many of them are themselves quite abstract, involving imaginary games to take individuals into outer space and watching how light does or does not travel. Sometimes there's some historical irony that is missing. Theories of relativity return us to what is often described as indigenous knowledge systems. Relationality, relativity, cycles. Perhaps unsurprisingly, as time becomes dismembered from place, time itself, performed less in relationality and more via instruments of measurement, especially in clocks and various other forms of temporal standardization, grew in importance. As if by focusing more and more on time, that would somehow lead to something that resembles control. We use time in our calendars to locate ourselves, to ground ourselves. Oh, what time is it? What do I have to do next? Let me check my Google Calendar. We who have become so disconnected from the actual ground we are on, we keep trying to locate ourselves in time, as if that is somehow going to help us become grounded in place. Sometimes I think the instinct, if we know the time, will we also know where we are, is a bit confusing. But maybe sometimes it also makes sense. After all, time should bring us back to place. That's how we are made. Time and place are intimately connected, after all. Imperial anxieties of scarcity were projected onto time itself. And time, largely unmoored from place, how was it to respond? Did it find itself going faster, speeded up by an increasingly networked economy where places were somehow more and more tightly interwoven into faster speeds, even as ecologies and traditional knowledge were in various stages of dying? Of course, time doesn't move at different speeds. That's weird. But that's what it feels like sometimes. The time keeps getting faster. Today, that perpetual feeling of not having enough time pervades the lives of most people I know, and probably most of the people you know too. Metaphors of scarcity and stress and value abound. We talk about how we spend time not having enough time, about being slaves to time, about longing to be off the clock. Advertisers invite us to have me time. Perhaps unsurprisingly, in a world that equates the accumulation of things with security, we either have enough or not enough time, as if time is something you can hold, like an object. But time is more fluid than an object. It courses through us, surrounds us, shapes us. Time and space, sometimes which we can refer to as place, are integrated, one within and around and through the other, like water and land and water. Life as we know it needs both. Though of course there is time out there in other places, places without water, and time is not water, and without water there is no life, at least not as we know it. It's just time, embedded into and shaped by places, running water and crumbling mountains and breathing groves of trees and moving clouds. Time is inherently part of the collective. It is shared. And really, there is a storm howling outside of our doors, and there is no time. And certainly, really, how is there any time to consider something as abstract as the nature of time? Co-rising rhythm, from and alongside. We survive in time. Time binds us to place. Colonization dismembered the relationship between space and time. Time dismembers us from place. The more you can feel the rhythm. Can you feel the rhythm of the breath of the trees? The cycle of a solar year? The orbit of a life? In this space, speaking of time and no time, we enter into a space that resembles ceremony. You know, when I first started talking about remembering, I did so because I needed an alternative to the concepts evoked by such phrases as re-narrating history. Re-narration and restoring risks staying in the space between the head and the heart, the throat chakra of communication and conventional wisdom around storytelling. But the stories we are talking about shifting and debunking and unraveling here are not simply written down, or even in oral traditions, though many of them are written down, and many more are in oral traditions. I'm talking about the remembering that is embodied, the stories that live in human bodies in metaphor. My body, my father's body, my grandfather's body, for mind is embodied. These are metaphors and stories in our landscapes, in pastoral grass landscapes and forests filled with tiny, thin, very young trees, and crowded pig farms, and the precise boundary of a national park, a boundary that no bird would ever recognize. They are in our built environment. They are in real estate practices of zoning and redlining and proof of sale and what is real estate anyways. The stories are embedded in our legal system. They are in the very shape of the columns outside of the Hall of Justice. The term remembering helps me to get beyond the notion that a story, a narration, is something written or spoken, and to move into the embodied and physical dimensions that make this work so challenging, so exhilarating, so somatic. And the term invites me and continues to invite me, like something I know but am also still just learning, to reconsider my relationship with time. Even now, after many years of practicing and learning to walk on this path, I still have so many times when I lean into urgency in a way that is disruptive of what I know to be true. Even now, as much as I have come to love the darkness, for so much of what I am speaking really is about a flight away from the dark, I still have a tendency to leave my lights on at night, to stay up late reading, to want the supposed comfort of the electrical light, even though I know the power of just being in the darkness, even though I know that there is a place where darkness sings, even though I know that dawn arises from dark. I have to say that when I speak of darkness, I am speaking of the beautiful sacred dark. I am not speaking of darkness and conflating it with evil. That is kind of unhelpful. For too long, it's actually been a quick and ready metaphor. And then when we associate darkness, including but not only blackness, with evil, it is part of a larger set of metaphors that perpetuates racism. As my friend Reverend Retta says, let us return innocence to the dark. to let the darkness be darkness. And part of that is to just have darkness. As Clark Strand points out, we keep running away from the dark, lighting our electrical lights all night long. It can be hard to actually experience darkness, what with all the blinking, flashing, buzzing lights, from batteries to televisions to cell phones in our homes to light pollution, headlights and street lights. We seem to be at war with the darkness. Even the work of lighting a fire on winter solstice has a different meaning in a time when there is just so much light. If part of time is a shifting, changing experience between day and night, then what happens to our sense of time if we deny ourselves the experience of the dark, of night? Can we bring ourselves back to the sacred dark? And if we do, can that shift our sense of time? Can we remember time itself? Time embedded in the rhythm of the moon, pulling the waves that come and go from the shore. Time embedded in the shorebirds that dance with waves as they watch for the creatures just underneath the surface. Time that we share with the microbes within our bodies. Time which works with water to shape rocks and canyons and gorges, and the roaring thunder beings who dance at the bottom of Niagara Falls, and so much that can bring us up short, stop us in our tracks, and enter a space of timelessness. The question of if we can remember time back into places, including our own body, is in part a theological question, as it is in part theologians who help to take it out of the earthly and human bodies to begin with, abstracting it. Now, I like to believe that the best theology, like any other good form of theory and philosophy, is that which arises from practice, then coalesces into theory, which subsequently can inform practice. I keep trying. For over 7 years, I've been engaging in this work of remembering, through teaching different ways of approaching histories, co-creating origin stories, integrating stories, experiences, and memories that have been largely discounted and dismembered from the collective. That's part of how the name for this podcast came about, the Remembering and Re-enchanting podcast. I find that the work flows like watercolors, from remembering to re-enchanting. At the same time, I've been developing particular tools around circular time calendars. I also create rituals, which is nothing if not a form of highly embodied and multidimensional time. And all of this time humbles me, brings me to the edge of my own unknowings. Who am I to utter into the darkness? The more I learn, the more I want to bow before the deities of time, some of whom I have seen in the shadows lurking. Hopefully they are at the least amused. It is so mysterious and vast, and we are so small. For all that we live within it, time continues to baffle and swath our meager imaginations. I started teaching circular calendars because a student in my remembering class asked me to. It's a simple enough story, how I came to it. Whilst in the early phases of starting what several people had informed me was a nearly impossible task that I had given myself of launching an eco-theology company that leaned heavily into decolonization, I had a mystical moment. A process came to me. A set of clear instructions. The instructions were for a way of engaging with the lunar cycle. I did it for myself, starting with the lunar calendar. There's the calendar, and then there's a process I use, which came to me in some kind of mystical moment that is kind of hard to explain because it's not, I think, about explanation. So amidst all of this circularity, let me make sure I'm being clear what I'm talking about here. A circular or cyclical calendar is a way of conceptualizing time in the shape of a circle instead of a straight line. Moon circles Earth. Earth circles, or orbits, Sun. Sun cycles through the galaxy, etc. Now, if you're going to use a cyclical process on a two-dimensional sheet of paper, you can draw your year in a circle. I like to start at the winter solstice at the bottom of the page, work my way up and around the top of the page with the summer solstice, and then over to the fall equinox, and then coming down back to the bottom of the page to the winter solstice, starting the year again. I always have a space between the two winter solstices because, of course, time is not a circle. It is much more of a spiral. In this very simple way, we can visually represent Earth's circle and cycle around the sun. In the circular time courses that I offer, the bulk of the work is less about simply drawing a circle and more about the work with the circle and the questions that our process invites people like you to do. But the calendar and the reflective process that I first started using with the lunar cycle is essentially what I started to teach with a solar cycle. Calendars and reflective processes tend to work together. That's just how temporal technologies are. Form and function and process intertwine. No technology is completely objective from the people who create and use it. For myself, I have presumptions and assumptions that not only are we earthly, muddy, embodied beings, but we need to be in that entanglement. And that we want to. And that we already are participating in earth time. And so how can we get a bit closer in how we are imagining, engaging, and embodying it? Now, as I've been teaching about circular time, I've noticed that there's several themes that keep coming up which seem pertinent to this larger conversation. I think these themes tell us something, not so much about my students, so that maybe yourself as individuals, but more about the wider society in which we live. The first set of themes has to do with questions that sound a little bit like this. How do you relate to the seasons in the place where you live? Where am I? Am I traveling? What is home? Where do I belong? How do I belong into my ecology? The second main theme is that people realize that they are actually doing a lot. Most people have a background story that they are not doing very much, or not doing enough, or not doing the right thing. And then when they engage with the circular cyclical calendar process that we have, there is almost always a, oh, that pause. Oh, I'm actually doing a lot. The third main theme that arises is, how am I resting? Where is a space for grief and mourning, feeling run down? Where do I let myself engage with sorrow? Is there a space for me somewhere to engage with loss? And then people see clearly, more clearly, how their lives are deeply influenced by structures, especially temporal structures that are much bigger than they are. These themes all point to something about our dominant culture's linear temporal cycles that deny the need for rest, for grief, for our slow and aching process of healing. It points to the always already listening discourse of scarcity, insufficiency, and disconnection from the collective environmental space. These are the lurking shadows of linearity and endless growth, and the ridiculous notion of perpetual material progress based on finite, embodied earthly resources that overcrowd our minds and weighs heavily upon our spirits. That perpetual anxiety has something to do with how time is so disconnected from place. Within all of this are some rather tyrannical notions of measurement of human worth, within which most people feel that they tend to fall short. I can link this to some pretty old Christian theologies of what is worthiness and what is godliness and what is the role of protection. And that's really enough material for a whole another podcast. So let me just say here that it has some of, though not all of its roots in the Middle Ages, and then came to take a particular form during the Protestant Revolution and Calvinism. Whilst Puritanism has largely dissipated in contemporary culture, notions about measurements of the human being, about land and property systems, that continue to haunt and often hurt us. The yardstick of progress is one that none of us can ever fully measure up to, especially if it is attempted to be applied to the length of a human spirit or life. In other words, these symptoms are all aspects of a modern, diseased, and discontent world. Not just capitalism, but hyperdrive, of being filled with unrealistic expectations that combine internal feelings of not enoughness with a hard material reality that we really are using up too much of our world's precious resources. So what that leads to is that part of what it means to create a new economic system, a new way of living together, entails new calendar systems. We need new temporal technologies. My friend and sometimes student Andrew Murray Dunn framed this into a particular beautiful question. What are the liturgical cycles of a new economy? One thing for sure, they are cyclical. They have rhythms that can lead us into ecological calendars. They echo and attend to planetary rhythms such as solstices and equinoxes. And for them to work, they will be bound in cosmovision, in story, and in song. Which is not to say that we are necessarily trying to replicate one particular culture, such as the Celtic Wheel of the Year. One of my frustrations is that sometimes when people lean upon cyclical calendars, they try to take a cyclical calendar from one culture and simply put it down onto wherever they are. And that kind of misses the point. The way we do it is that we try to help people intertwine multiple calendars, multiple cyclical calendars, giving respect for both wherever you come from, as well as the calendar systems indigenous to where you are. Humans are really good at working with multiple calendar systems. Which is really good because in our global world, we need multiple calendars. We need the micro and the macro. We need lunar and solar and interfaith. We need rhythms of earth to dictate and inform the rhythms of business. Universal or large-scale ways of understanding time enable mail systems to work across multiple places, Zoom calls and trains and airplanes, and all the things we currently rely upon to function. To say we need better calendars does not mean we have to completely throw out the ones we currently have. To say we need to work with circles and spirals does not mean we can't also work with squares and lines, or triangles, or any other shape we might find supportive. Some of this is about multiplicity, complexity, and using shapes, symbols, and meters that support us and our kin who might not be human. A liturgical calendar that can help us navigate a regenerative economy is multifaceted. And then there is the bigger question, the harder question. And frankly, this is a question that I keep pondering, which is not about what is a calendar and time system that can take us closer to earthly cycles, but what can take us closer to earthly cycles at a time when, due to the legacies of colonization in our current economic system, earthly cycles are changing. Climate change is changing time. The seasons are not what they were. Fire season and flood season are now critical parts of planning, or at least they really should be, in California. What are the cycles of rituals that we need to honor the death of species, the burning of trees? And what are the cycles of care that include returning to indigenous land management practices that now need to be integrated into our collective calendars, specific to different places and essential to our survival? One such care, such as burning landscapes in ways that prevented catastrophic wildfires, was attached to ceremonies, cosmovisions, and a larger calendar that integrated it into the daily and yearly life cycle of a people. I talked about this on an earlier podcast in a wonderful episode with Indigenous leader and fire ceremonialist Ron Good about cultural burning. You might want to check it out. Before us, here now, is the need to create a calendar system that can enable us to survive, because if you haven't noticed, winter sometimes feels like spring, and spring sometimes feels like summer, and summer is just so hot. Embedded in these new calendars will have to be the ecological practices of care, the shift and change with the seasons. It has to be built on traditional ecological knowledge. It has to be led by elders. It has to integrate science. It has to train and work with young people. It has to entail storytelling and ceremonies and rituals of coming of age and entering into each phase of life and of dying. Oh, we absolutely have to work with all that is dying. Circular, cyclical, spiraling calendars. These are for the collective. Calendars are like tree rings and ocean waves and mushrooms that grow season after season. Time is always written and drawn upon the landscape. The dead echo their lives back to us from the facial structures that we see every day in the mirror from our relatives to the softness in the soil. The land and the waters remember the stories and the songs that we ourselves have at times forgotten. Several years ago, a ritual came to my partner and I. She is an Indigenous woman, but this ritual does not come from her people. It came to both of us at spring equinox in 2021, from a source neither of us really cares or bothers to name. We tend to call it something somewhat banal, like circular time ritual or embodied circular time ritual, or just time walking for time walkers, like you. What we know for sure, or as sure as we can, is that while this came to us very recently, it is very ancient. It is a ritual that we have practiced, led, and taught to people in Canada and California, in England and in New York, and everywhere people have responded to it. And what I can tell you without describing the whole thing, which I think will totally not do it justice, is that there are ways of embodying our relationship to time and space that we are only just beginning to engage with. It is indeed possible to do what we are thinking of calling time walking, ways of going backwards to what once was and forwards to what can be, sometimes at the same time, time bending here and now. And it's really just here and now anyway, all of it. Really, maybe somewhere, somehow, maybe you too have had that moment when there is no time. world, W-O-R-L-D, comes from an old Germanic word, world, W-O-R-U-L-D, which comes from a Proto-Germanic set of words. Wor meaning man and ald meaning age, which is to say world means the age of man. Now, there's just so much we can do with this one idea, and indeed Tolkien has done a great deal with it. But let's just skim the top surface, noting that a term for time has tumbled into a term for place, and that our ancestors understood that time and place were connected. It doesn't take much to realize that there are realities and worlds which are beyond the borders and thresholds of man. As the writer Craig Slee describes, it is only modernity that divides the cosmos between civilization and nature, a division many of us are trying rather desperately to thwart and to find some other form of multiplicity. For many in medieval Europe, or at least certainly the Norse and their predecessors, acknowledged a multiplicity of worlds. There were the dwelling places of gods, homes for giants and elves, and they would often intermarry, and ambiguity, more than some polite or even dominating notion of civilization, guided their fluid ways of being. Theirs was a crisscrossing of boundaries and states of being that those of us who are artists and writers and mystics keep yearning for, finding, grasping, losing, returning to. Those moments of ecstasy. Ecstasy itself is a word that maintains the entrancement and astonishment and insanity that can come from being both of this world and of other worlds, traveling between them, yet still here, where we reclaim the old German term Hexusa, translating into witch, but literally meaning hedge rider, or she who rides in the old growth of medicine and magic that continues to grow, prickly and dangerous and enticing, in between the oh so ordinary fields. And so we are here taking a curvature journey, a little bit of a curvature journey around time. Now let's just see if I can weave us through and come to a landing pad. Don't worry too much. I know you might also be running out of time. It's okay to pause. I'm almost there. We do not have to live thus, unmoored. Even as we have been in some ways separated from the ways that time is linked into space, into place, into the microclimates and the trees and birds and migrations and the cycles of organisms, we also cannot be fully separate from those rhythms. For those rhythms are always in the many microcultures living within our bodies, and we who are here on this earth are always embodied. We are also time. I don't mean that we are a ticking clock, although there are some ways in which that's also true. After all, our heartbeat keeps time, and it's different when we are resting. The time beat, the rhythm of our heart is different at rest than it is when we are running, than it is when we are reading a story on a podcast that you will hear in a different time and in a different place than where I am right now. You know, we are already part of that web of relationality, part of the dynamic particles of relativity. And this is how mystery shifts, opens and expands and does some weird things with our sense of time. As Doctor Who says, time is really, really complicated. It is a ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff. Sometimes in my one-to-one work, where I get to work with some really remarkable people, I create what I think of as healing rituals or sessions. I don't always like the term healing because it implies that we're returning to a broken thing, to wholeness. But if we are working with multi-generational shifts, then, well, the person might not really know what the next step towards wholeness looks like. And anyways, the work just keeps going. Revelation after revelation. Greater profoundness. Another moment. Not better or worse than the last, but still quite amazing. Touch, was my first language. My first livelihood training was a body worker, long before I did theology or social science or finance or anthropology. I like to think that continues to inform what I do. But when I'm doing one-to-one sessions, of course I feel time differently. And I can't say it's a year or a century or millennia. Sometimes the energy in those sessions can feel like it's expanding into a lifetime. Sometimes it can feel like the person is carrying something that is generations old, passed from mother to daughter to son to daughter, on, and here it is again. The twist of the back, the pain in the shoulder, the joyous capacity for laughter. That old pain that seems to itself be walking through time. Whenever I can, I will bring in something older, a pine cone, a redwood seed, a shell, the sound of the flute, the wash of water. And we enter into the time that's not really any time. From that time that's of no time, I can say such thing as, yes, we carry the trauma of generations, and we carry the healing too. Within us is the cycle before the cycle was broken. Within us is a circle that was never broken. That circle, that is also carried in time and in rhythm and in sound, in breath, in dance. From places of no time, we can return to time as it already is, embedded in bodies and menses and cycles, ocean currents and bloodstreams, and trees. Yes, oh, thank you, trees. Trees that breathe us into being.
Walked inside the labyrinth last Halloween. Heed the call, catch the train to the Highland Queen. Singing on the heath until the Selkies cried, just following that vision you felt in July. The roundhouse stands at the top of the hill, the big dish thorn grows silent and still. Did you pick their berries? Did you drink their brew? Did you leave them there? They still wait for you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Remembering and Re-enchanting podcast. If you are enjoying what you are hearing, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review. I am always happy to hear from you, dear listener, to continue finding ways to connect the disconnected and go deeper on your own journey of remembering and re-enchanting with your communities, your organizations, and your families. I invite you to check out our courses and other community offerings via the Sequoia Summit Via website. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Though I must admit I spend much more time working with really amazing people than crafting social media. If you want to work with me one-on-one or bring me to speak at your organization or family office, you can find out more at sarahjelena.com.